Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leslie Holland. I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist in fruit crop pathology at UW-Madison. And on behalf of UW-Madison Extension and University of Minnesota Extension, we welcome you to the Pesticide Selection and Resistance Management for Your Vineyard webinar series. Today's webinar will be focused on grape disease management, best practices for disease and fungicide resistance management, with our co-speakers today, Michele Moyer from Washington State University and Tim Miles from Michigan State University. So Michele Moyer is an associate professor and extension specialist for viticulture in the Department of Horticulture at Washington State University, based at the Irrigated Agriculture Research and Extension Center in Prosser, Washington. Her extension responsibilities cover viticulture, education across the state, and includes juice, processing, and wine grape production. Her research program focuses on integrated pest management with an emphasis on the interface between plant physiology and pest management. She has active research and extension projects on fungicide resistance, nematode management, rootstock evaluations, trunk disease management, sprayer optimization, and education and powdery mildew management. Very busy. Tim Miles is the assistant professor in the Department of Plant Soil Microbial Sciences at Michigan State University and is located in East Lansing, Michigan. His research focuses on his research focuses on pathogen management using fungicides and the underlying mechanisms of fungicide resistance within blueberries, grapes, hops, and other small fruit crops. In extension, Tim works with growers to develop and implement best management practices within the systems he conducts research. One critical aspect of his extension program is conducting fungicide efficacy testing. Before we jump into our talks today with our speakers, we ask that attendees remain muted and please enter your questions into the chat box for the end of the presentations. Additionally, we hope to get your feedback at the end of our presentations today with a very brief survey, so please stick around. And finally, a quick reminder of our upcoming webinars, March 17th, looking at FRAC and IRAC codes with myself and my counterpart, Christelle Godot, in entomology here at UW-Madison, and finally on April 7th, doing herbicide selection webinar as well. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to our speakers.
Well, thanks, Leslie, for the introduction. Can you hear me all right?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start us off, and then Michele will come in afterwards. So I'm going to talk about grape disease management, best management practices for disease and fungicide resistance. So this is a nice, lovely Botrytis grape cluster. If you're a pathologist, you'd like to see this. If you're a grape grower, you won't. And today, what I wanted to mostly focus on is just an overview of early diseases that we typically see, do a little talk on resistance management, and then focus in specifically on downy mildew and Botrytis bunch rot. So we kind of looking at a season-long thing. If you're thinking in Michigan, we are kind of concerned about several different diseases. So some of our early season ones, which I have a couple follow-up slides, are phomopsis and black rot. Those overwinter in a vineyard and can be problematic. This sort of time window here gives you a sense of when you might want to monitor and control for those, and then at what point there's a little bit of a lesser risk for those. But generally, phomopsis and black rot are your earliest diseases to worry about and to control for. And then downy is probably the second, powdery as well would come in at that second time. Where Botrytis is going to be more of a late season disease, except around bloom as well. So this is just a season-long look if you think about grape diseases. So I still think that dormant applications are quite helpful when you think about grapes, and it's primarily because of black rot and phomopsis and a little bit of anthracnose. So I know don't have much in here on anthracnose, but I know if you're growing Minnesota hybrids, anthracnose can be an issue in those cultivars. So I think that things like lime sulfur, sulfurix, lime sulfur ultra, different products, some of the oils potentially, but usually the sulfur type based products tend to be a little bit more effective. Usually those are meant for destroying overwintering inoculum, and they're really helpful, particularly for these groups of pathogens, because they don't reproduce as quickly as something like powdery mildew. Dormant applications you shouldn't think about are really doing a lot for powdery mildew. They might delay infection by a little bit, but it's not, the generations happen so fast it's not really what dormant sprays are targeting. So if you think about Phomopsis, and I put this in here just because even in Star Trek, in 200 or 300 years, they still are applying dormant sprays of some kind. I don't know what that is that they're spraying in this sci-fi vehicle, but essentially Phomopsis really needs to be controlled between about 1 to 10 inches of shoot growth. Really the pre-bloom and bloom sprays tend to be the most important when you think about Phomopsis. But spraying really alone isn't exactly the best and only way to control Phomopsis. It's really destroying overwintering inoculums. So pruning does a lot to help get rid of Phomopsis and getting rid of diseased canes. In our pathology vineyard, where we actually want to have Phomopsis grow, we're often trying to get more of those old canes because that's a lot of where the disease comes from. Anything that reduces air circulation is also going to help control Phomopsis. But the main chemicals we typically use are the EBDC fungicides. These are like the mancozebs or the manzates, things like that as a main control. And black rot in a lot of ways is similar, except it's overwintering more on mummies. So these are old dried up fruit that typically fell off or didn't get harvested from the previous season. Dormant sprays can be helpful here. Also overwinter on leaf litter as well. But how we manage it's pretty similar in terms of using dormant sprays, anything that helps air circulation. We have models for black rot. I don't really contend, and they're available on MSU and you can look at them. I don't contend that they're all that helpful though. And it's mainly because, black rot infections require wetness, and, the temperatures need to be between 50 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And the wetness, it needs to be between 20, as short as 6 hours, but as long as 24 hours. But in Michigan, we constantly have these events. So I'm not really sure that timing it based on weather patterns is really going to help much in terms of controlling when black rot infections happen, just because we have a lot of wetting events throughout the season. So I wanted to talk a little bit about fungicide resistance before I get into it, and I'll have some examples at the end here. But this is a project that Michele and I are both a part of, or Michele's leading it. And it's if you want to know how fungicide resistance works, and Michele might go into it more in detail, we have this nice website that you can check out, grower resources. And this is a national project that looks at fungicide resistance in grapes. And we also have some nice videos that can kind of show you how fungicide resistance develops at a more basic level as well. But really, essentially, because we're applying similar fungicides over and over to control some of these diseases, it's a continued selection of resistant individuals. So you can think about this leaf up here. We had one red dot, and you killed all the green dots, and over time, there'll be more and more red dots. So it's a whole shift in the population that really causes it. An example here is in powdery mildew of grape. It's able to germinate at almost 100 or 1,000 times more concentration of flint or trifloxystrobin once it acquires that resistance. There are different types of resistances to think about. There's cross resistance, which occurs with one fungicides that results in resistance to another. This typically occurs when you're in the same mode of action. So that's why we have the FRAC code system, where you have FRAC 11 fungicides and FRAC 7, and that's because there can be cross resistance within that chemical class. There's also multiple resistance, where you have an isolate or a type of fungus that's resistant to more than one mode of action. I'm not going to talk about negative cross resistance for the time, but basically how these fungicides typically work. The main ones that we use, they really affect fundamental processes of that fungi have, and they'll inhibit various aspects of fungal growth. Some will stop them from dividing, some will stop them from making energy, and so forth. And that's sort of how we've designed these FRAC classes. But anyway, if resistance is occurring, but you're not really sure how it'll affect management, cultural practices are really important to help manage fungicide resistance. Pruning practices, plant spacing, nutrient management, irrigation management, using best spray practices, which I think we'll get into a little bit later. And then thinking about your disease management program. And it's important to think about when you're managing, what are you really trying to manage for? And you're really a big proponent of frame is to try to think about planning ahead. So some of the extension activities around resistance management have really been about having a seasonal setup where you're planning on spraying these products throughout the season and you have contingency plans. Because if you plan ahead, you can really develop a better program. And I'm of the opinion that using contact fungicides and biologicals really have a good place because they are unique modes of action to be incorporated into a program. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about downy mildew here. So downy mildew we have fungicide resistance issues in downy mildew. There's been some resistance in Frac 40, which would be Revis, and then there's been also a resistance in the QOI group, which are a little unique for downy mildew, but those are fungicides like resin and tannos. Before I really get into downy mildew in too much detail, there is a bunch of information out there that you can download for downy mildew and what could explain to you everything about the biology of the disease. We in Michigan, I'll throw out our fruit management guide. So we update this annually in Michigan. It can be downloaded from the internet. And this is where we put our fungicide efficacy ratings, and we'll talk a little bit about the disease itself. But there's a lot of information on the internet about downy mildew of grape. It's a very well-known disease. The symptoms in grape, though, look a little different if you're looking at the bottom of the leaf or the top of the leaf. So you'll typically see sporulation on the bottom of the leaf. This is where all the sporangia typically are. And you'll mostly see chlorosis or yellowing, kind of a blocky type yellowing on the leaf surface. Over time, though, those leaves will start to become necrotic. So downy mildew starts off kind of living with its host, but then after a while, it starts to kill the grape tissue and it will eventually defoliate it. And the defoliation can become pretty stark, where you'll have, huge areas that'll become defoliated. And really, that's the biggest concern in downy mildew in Michigan, is that we're really worried about vines getting prematurely defoliated, and they're not able to store enough starch or enough carbon to overwinter and have good cold hardiness to make it through the winter. So if you're at a suboptimal site where you're growing grapes kind of at the limit of where they could be grown, you really want to worry about the defoliation that can happen with downy mildew. Downy mildew can also infect young clusters, and so you can often see young clusters that got infected quite a while ago, and then now the sporulation's kind of rearing its ugly head here. It also downy mildew gets its name just because it looks kind of soft when you look at it and somewhat fluffy, and that's sort of what you see. It's quite a bit different from powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is more diffuse than downy mildew. Downy mildew is a lot more fluffy, but it can infect and cause yield loss. And if you're in a place like a southern climate, that's actually what you care about more when you think about downy mildew. If you were in Georgia, you'd worry a lot more about the fruit loss than you would necessarily the overwintering damage caused by defoliation. But the way downy mildew works, it's not a fungus really. It's an omycete. It thrives on water. They used to call this group of organisms water molds. And really, any kind of rain event is really going to drive an epidemic. It actually produces spores that can swim, and it can swim along thin films of water along the grape plant and infect new parts of the plant that way. So really, any amount of water and any rain period, any wetting event is really going to cause downy mildew epidemics to kind of explode, typically. So when you think about conditions favoring infection, it's really temperatures that are above 55 when you have high periods of relative humidity. So typically in Michigan, we often see a lot of downy mildew epidemics really take off in August because we get these long periods of dew. So we have dew almost every single day in a row, and that can really drive an epidemic. And this is an example of severity with bloom and what sort of severity and inoculation relative to bloom. So bloom is a really critical time to control some of these initial infections, just because the bloom, not only can the fruit get infected, but it can also be the precursor to starting like a foliar epidemic that can happen on the leaves. So initially leaves and fruit are susceptible, but fruit become resistant over time. So this is a study from a while ago at Cornell where they looked at different varieties of grapes. This got Concord in it and Chardonnay and Riesling. And basically fruit were, susceptible at about minus 12 days of bloom and about 0. But after 7 days post bloom, the infection dropped off kind of. You didn't get much infection that would occur. So if you're concerned about fruit loss, really being concerned up until bloom is the time to worry. but foliar loss is a season-long problem. So fungicides do work, thankfully, for downy mildew. This is an example of a trial where we sprayed a couple different products like Revis and a little bit of the manzates as well to help control, and the phosterol as well to help control it. We still had downy mildew in this plot. This is where I do a lot of research for downy mildew, but it's it did help control the defoliation, and we had some really nice fruit here. And basically, the untreated had no fruit or no leaves practically. So fungicides do work. Unfortunately, there's resistance that's been reported for downy mildew. So nearly every chemical class for downy mildew has fungicide resistance that's been reported either in the US or in Europe. They're not always quite sure how the resistance has happened, but these are products like Tanos, Ranman, Ridamil, Revis, and Zampro, where are kind of your main downy mildew materials. Besides other contact products like Captan and such. But some of our big gun heavy hitter fungicides, there's a lot of resistance that's been reported. We've at MSU, we've done some screening for resistance in the CAA class, which is Revis, and the QOIs that work on downy mildew. And we found quite a bit of QOI resistance in downy mildew. And some initial evidence that in New York, we've been finding some resistance in CAAs. And that's concerning because FRAC 40 or CAAs is a really big part of a lot of our management programs for downy mildew. So this is something to keep an eye out and think about how to manage these. So I'll go through this quickly just in the interest of time, but botrytis is a really important disease too. And it's probably our most important cluster rot of grape. There are other cluster rots that I don't have time to really get into too much. And we're kind of stuck in this one because we're really primarily controlling it with fungicides besides other cultural practices that we do. We don't have as many tools in the toolbox for this guy. So symptoms look like that: fuzzy gray sporulation on the fruit. It's a problem in tight clusters primarily. So Pinot Noir or Vigneault typically get quite a bit of botrytis. And there's some certain things that can trigger bunch rot. So when you think about bunch rot, you typically get it often when you have wounds. So it's well known that things like powdery mildew can exacerbate and cause botrytis. So it's a biotic thing, but other things like bird packs, insect feeding, other things can cause botrytis. And it can also be caused by mechanical damage, things like, vineyard equipment coming through the field, doing leaf removal, things like that, or any kind of splitting due to excess water or precipitation can cause it. And typically when you scouting doesn't always work for botrytis. So when you're out in the field and you're going to try to scout for botrytis, it's not always possible because really, if you've got to the point where you can see a lot of botrytis out in the field, it might almost be too late. This is me coming to scout. Once you get to the point of seeing this in the field, it's really not a time to control botrytis. Botrytis also can drive other cluster rots and other issues with other insects. So sour rot is a problem in grapes, especially in tight cluster varieties. And you'll often find a cluster, usually not an individual berry, but a cluster that'll have both botrytis and sour rot all on it. And if you start to have one type of rot, it can actually lead to other issues, like other insects that are coming to those rotten fruit. I'll be quick about some of this, but anything that promotes air circulation, shoot positioning, things like that are good practices. Anything that can prevent damage to fruit is really important. There are some resistant varieties. Choosing the best form of irrigation to limit canopy growth and reduce canopy wetness can be helpful. But ultimately we're kind of stuck with a preventative spray program sometimes. So some of the main things, multi-site fungicides typically aren't that great. So this is things like Captan, Xyriam, and copper-based products aren't that strong on botrytis. There are some biological ones that have moderate efficacy, but primarily we're stuck with a lot of site-specific products that are the most effective. And the issue is that we've been finding resistance in these. So this is sort of a translation of some of these products. These are some of the main products up here. And there's resistance in almost all of them, and it's a pretty high abundance. I'll show one more slide, but not much in fludioxamil, which is part of switch. So that's sort of one caveat, but we have quite a bit of fungicide resistance that we've been finding to botrytis. This was a study in Michigan, and these are those same modes of action broken up slightly differently, but there was an increase from looking at 2014 to 2018 isolates. And if you pull off isolates of botrytis, you might find isolates that are resistant to 6 or sometimes 7 different fungicides. So we're still trying to figure out how to manage botrytis, but we have isolates that are increased frequency in terms of how much their resistance. Kind of like all this stuff, we're still working on how to modify management practices based on finding resistance. And it makes cultural practices even more important. So things like, having good air circulation, leaf pulling if possible, and trying to minimize damage can be really important for botrytis in particular. So there's a lot of folks that have helped me with my program, and I work on blueberries and hops as well, so I left everybody in. So with that, I'll pass it off to Michele. So thank you, everybody.
Sorry, there, it did not want me to talk, Tim. It said you still had more time, and it would not.
Did I have more time? I can keep talking, but
I know you can. That's exactly.
All right, I'll be quiet now.
Oh no, just giving you a hard time because that's what we do. All right, so Tim gave an excellent overview on some of the early season diseases, and I'm going to be betting cleanup here with powdery mildew, and then also kind of getting into kind of the bigger picture of what FRAME is. That's what Tim mentioned is the large national project that dedicated to fungicide resistance. And I'm also going to sprinkle in a little bit on sprayer calibration and how important sprayers are for managing diseases, because I think that's something we often tend to overlook. All right. Here we go. So just like Tim, I have a nice little overview. It's more for me to keep me on track than it is for you, but we are going to cover powdery mildew disease biology and management. We're going to talk a little bit about fungicide resistance in powdery mildew. And I think that's the sad part, is because just like with some of the diseases that Tim mentioned, it's real in powdery mildew as well. And of course, cover some important application strategies and sprayers and how that influence both disease management, fungicide resistance selection, and all the fun stuff related to IPM and vineyards. So first, let's talk a little bit about grape powdery mildew. Tim did a great overview on all the different fungi that are out there. Powdery mildew is just simply one of them. Powdery mildew, like downy mildew, is a relatively unique pathogen, or in our case, fungus, that is quite specific to grape. It doesn't infect, and the powdery mildew that infects grapes doesn't infect anything else. So for those of you planting roses at the edge of your vineyards, it's a great thing, looks fantastic. Different mildew on rose than what's going into the vineyard. Powdery mildew evolved with many of the North American grape species, which is why several of the hybrids that are grown in the Midwest tend to be a bit more resistant to powdery mildew. Mildew just really isn't typically that bad on them, but it is horrible on Vitis vinifera, or the European wine grape. And that's where a lot of the research on grape powdery mildew tends to come from. It is a fungus that infects the surface of tissues. And so once it infects that surface, that tissue is compromised. And so in the case of grapes, when they're infected early after fruit set and those berries then try to expand, those berries either just desiccate and die, or if they infect the fruit kind of at the end of an infection period, which we'll talk about in the next slide, as those berries expand, they can then split when powdery mildew is covering the surface. Tim also mentioned earlier about dormant spray applications and their benefit in managing some of those early season diseases, and they can give you a little bit of help with grape powdery mildew. But he mentioned that they're not, those dormant sprays are not the greatest against powdery mildew for one basic factor that I think really emphasizes or highlights what this fungus does, and that's it reproduces excessively rapidly, multiple cycles, generation cycles within a growing season, and it's just really hard to get ahead of this disease once you fall behind. It also overwinters in little tiny structures called chasmothecia or cleistothecia, and these little structures, which you can see hopefully with my mouse here, down here, these little guys have little Velcro-like appendages. So they attach themselves into bark crevices in the fall when they're washed off leaves after rain events. They hang out there all winter. They're super cold hardy. We have frozen them to -60 degrees Celsius. So very cold, and they're still 100% alive when you pull them out. So they can definitely handle winters. And then in the springtime, as they desiccate, they dry out over winter. So they get kind of like a flattened basketball. And then in the spring, they fill up with water. So they swell and absorb water, and then they dry and absorb and dry and absorb. And essentially just like metal fatigue, at some point, they then just rip open and spill out their ascospores that then float in the air and then infect grape growing tissue. The interesting thing with chasmothecia is they actually will release spores pretty much at any point in the Midwest or across the country about after January time frame or so. So if there's any type of liquid moisture, they will release spores. But those spores can only infect green growing tissue. That's the beauty of this particular fungus, is it has to be on green growing tissue in order for it to actively grow. And so it can release spores in March, April, and sometimes even in early May before bud break if there's nice warm weather conditions and sufficient precipitation, but those spores just don't land on anything and they can die. So when you have a nice warm wet spring before bud break, it's actually probably pretty good for powdery mildew management in the sense that it's depleting a little bit of that inoculum before it goes into the growing season. Hopefully though, with you guys growing several hybrids, you will never see mildew that looks like what you see here on the screen. And this is very much game over from a harvest perspective. So the beauty with powdery mildew, the fact that it's only lives on green growing tissue, it has evolved with the grape species, and it's super exposed on exterior tissues, is that it becomes a bit of a Goldilocks fungus, and that it likes conditions to be just right. It does not like extremes. And we can see this whether it's related to temperature, UV light, air moisture. And so with temperature, what we see here on the slide is that this is a speed at which powdery mildew will grow at certain temperatures, and it really prefers 77 degrees Fahrenheit. That's sweet spot. It's also, I think, many of our sweet spots as well. But when temperatures start to get below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, that the fungus just either just stalls out or doesn't grow at all. And in some cases, when we start to dip below about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, those cold nights that we can sometimes get after bud break actually kill powdery mildew and then cause the host to be transiently a little bit resistant to mildew for infection for up to 24 hours. So when we have really cold nights in the spring after bud break, while obviously it can give us some heart palpitations from a frost management perspective, it actually helps you with your powdery mildew management. Probably not as common in your area, but really common out here on the dry side of Eastern Washington. When temperatures start to get above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the same thing happens. The fungus will actually start to shut down. So really high summer temperatures can really suppress the growth and development of this fungus. Again, it's growing entirely on the surface of tissue. It is out there in the environment, doesn't always have good sunscreen, if you will, and it can, anytime there's high sunlight exposure, powdery mildew can really be suppressed, which is one of the main reasons why we talk about canopy management when we talk about grapevine powdery mildew. If you allow that canopy to be open up, allow it to get hot from the sun, allow UV light to get in there, and allow leaves to dry off really quickly, it provides a really good control basis for mildew. Mildew also doesn't like it too dry or too wet. If there's a lot of surface moisture on leaf tissue, powdery mildew will actually explode and die. The only point of this fungus life cycle that prefers water is in that chasmothecia, or that overwintering stage. After that, it does not like water films, which is why sometimes simply just continuously spraying leaf tissue with water can help control mildew. Not good for other diseases, but that's why people can often see in really wet years, powdery is just not an issue. Downy is going to be your problem. But when it gets really dry as well, because this fungus is on the surface of grape tissue, it will desiccate and dry out. So it really likes between about 40 and 95% relative humidity. This last picture here kind of highlights some of Tim's discussions on dormant spray applications and timing and all that fun stuff. And what we really noticed with powdery mildew, when chasmothecia form in the fall of last year, so when they form last year will influence when they release their spores the next year. So if they form early in the growing or early in the fall of last year, they'll release their spores early this year. If they form late, so if you have a really long, warm fall, those chasmothecia that form later in that time period will release their spores later into the following growing season. So if you want a silver lining, if you have an early frost, the silver lining to that is that it is effectively killing off a lot of the chasmothecia that might be overwintering and releasing spores later into the growing season for you next year. So I guess the one silver lining to some fall frosts. The beauty with grape powdery mildew, because it has evolved with grapes and it's super sensitive to how its host is developing, we can actually capitalize on that for designing spray programs. And I think the biggest advancement in disease management with powdery mildew was the discovery of ontogenic resistance. And that means age-related resistance. So as tissue gets older, it becomes resistant to grape powdery mildew. So when clusters are first emerging, they're super susceptible to powdery mildew, as we see here in the upper left picture on the slide. But there's not a lot of surface area for powdery mildew spores to hit. This is also early in the growing season. There's not a lot of inoculum out there, and temperatures might be getting colder. So your risk of infection is actually kind of low this time of year. But once those clusters have their rachis start to elongate and the individual florets start to separate out, that becomes a greater surface area for mildew spores to potentially land and infect. It's also going into later part of the growing season. So in your guys' case, I'm assuming that's probably around June-ish is when bloom is happening. It's great temperatures for powdery mildew. So not only are you having more surface area that the mildew spores can infect developing clusters, weather conditions are also really great. That happens all the way through bloom. But once we get about 3 to 4 weeks past fruit set, so well before bunch closure, those individual berries actually become resistant to mildew infection, provided they've been kept healthy up until that point. The rachis on grape clusters stay susceptible to powdery mildew throughout the entire growing season, but those individual berries will actually stay pretty clean. And by the time you get to harvest, if you see mildew on fruit going into harvest, that typically means that mildew infected that fruit about 6 weeks ago. So you're seeing very old infections. Those are not new infections. But the same thing happens with leaf tissue. And that really young, actively growing leaves tend to be the most susceptible to mildew, and older leaves actually become quite resistant. And so it's usually the leaves that are in that kind of glossy stage, transitioning from being really tiny and really hairy to totally matte, tend to be the most susceptible. And so by the time you see powdery mildew on those really old, mature leaves, those are very old infections. And the leaves were getting infected when they were about the stage that we see here on the lower right of the slide. So if we keep that in mind, that young tissue is what we need to protect, suddenly that really truncates the time of year that we have to really truly think about grapevine powdery mildew. And so when we think about mildew management, the first thing people ask is, well, what do I spray? And I don't particularly enjoy that conversation because I think it's really limiting, because there's a lot of other things we can do to control this disease. There are a lot of genetic approaches, and you guys are very lucky in the Midwest that you have a lot of those kind of built into the typical repertoire of grape varieties you're growing. A lot of them tend to have a mild to pretty good grapevine powdery mildew resistance, and that's excellent. That means that many less sprays you have to do for grape powdery mildew. There's also a ton of cultural practices. Anything that you can do to manage the canopy, whether it's allowing a slightly more open canopy in your trellising design, shoot thinning around the bloom period, fruit zone leaf removal, either early pre-bloom to bloom, all of that stuff really does help reduce the infection risk for grapevine powdery mildew. And then, of course, we finally have the chemical approaches. But my personal philosophy is first start with genetics, which you guys are lucky you have that, then add in your cultural practices. And then finally, when you've gotten those taken care of, then your chemical approaches are not so, they don't feel so scary when approaching a spray program. And you can actually kind of really play with what you want to do and what would be best for your management decisions on the site. I really, really do want to emphasize this. Again, most of you guys are growing varieties that are probably partially to fully resistant to grapevine powdery mildew, but some of the cool stuff coming down the pipeline out of breeding programs across the globe and in the United States, including University of Minnesota, I think are going to be absolute game changers for the wine grape industry, particularly for those who choose to adopt these approaches. A lot of these new varieties, if you think about a New York program growing Riesling, they probably spray 12, 15 times a year for powdery mildew. With these types of varieties, they can spray 2, right? I mean, that is a huge, significant environmental and economic impact for the growers choosing to adopt those varieties. And the wines are actually pretty good. We've tried some of them in some tastings here in Eastern Washington and have quite impressed. And especially if you guys are growing wines for sparkling or other desserts where you're using additional enology practices to kind of, either mask or manipulate that fruit, these would be excellent, I think, additions or considerations for production systems. Cultural approaches, I talked a little bit about that, but anything you can do that increases temperature, that increases sunlight, that kind of dries the canopy out will infinitely help you with your grapevine powdery mildew management and botrytis, as Tim mentioned. So how, one of the biggest challenges as a viticulturist is when I see vineyard rows that are really, really tight, because somebody saw that in Bordeaux, it's the real question is well, why? Tight rows means hard to drive your equipment down. It means potential shading, depending on how those rows are oriented. It also means reduced wind flow through those particular vineyards. So think about powdery mildew management actually starts at vineyard planting, right? The next thing to think about is how you want to trellis or handle that canopy shape, right? Not just row distance, but how is that canopy going to be shaped? And I know we all love VSP. It looks fantastic when it's perfectly managed, and nobody really wants to see a California sprawl outside of those folks growing it in California. But to be honest, even though this is a little bit of an extreme picture up here in the upper right of a California sprawl, that sprawly floppy canopy allows light to penetrate from all different angles. It allows the branches and leaves and the shoots to kind of move and flutter when wind is blowing through. You don't get that with the VSP. It's kind of akin to, you have a really wet beach towel and you either pack it tightly in your duffel bag for the next 8 hours, or you lay it out to dry in the sun. That's kind of the difference between having a VSP where you're packing wet tissue into a very tight area where it cannot dry out versus allowing it to kind of dry out a little bit. And then obviously canopy manipulation, fruit zone leaf removal, whether that's pre-bloom to bloom. I'm a big advocate of earlier the better. And then shoot thinning. All of that does, as you can kind of see down here, is it just really opens up the fruit zone. It allows air and sunlight to kind of circulate around those clusters. And for those that are choosing to do a chemical approach, it allows better chemical spray penetration into that fruit zone. And then finally, what do you do for a chemical approach? So how do you tie that together? And really chemical approaches, as Tim showed in his nice chart of season, is powdery mildew is more of a kind of a mid-season around bloom is the key. You can manage mildew between rachis and that, or between bud break and that early rachis elongation, but typically Mother Nature is helping you by having slightly cooler temperatures. You don't really have a lot of shoots out there. You don't really have a lot of clusters. There's just not a lot of, the risk of actual infection is pretty low. Multi-site products that you're probably spraying for a lot of other things during that time period are probably helping you out for your mildew management there as well. But once you get to that critical window for grape powdery mildew control on fruit, that rachis elongation to about 4 weeks post-bloom or 3 weeks post-fruit set, that's when you really focus on the best chemicals that you have available for you, provided you've also done things related to canopy management. You can also do some testing or scouting in those areas to see if you see any mildew. If you start to see mildew, get on it. Mildew is not one that waits for you, but really this critical window is when you really should be thinking about your best products available for you at the time. Once you get about 4 weeks post-bloom up through harvest, again, if you've kept that fruit clean, mildew will not infect the fruit anymore. So suddenly your management switches from protecting that harvestable crop to just keeping the canopy healthy. As Tim mentioned, having a nice healthy canopy going into the fall and winter season or fall season before leaf fall really does help the plant store carbohydrates for winter cold hardiness. But if you think about it, if you've kept mildew at bay up to about 4 weeks post-bloom, you've got a very short window now for mildew to actually kind of build up and go into harvest, or and to build up to a point where it's a problem by the end of harvest. So if you've done things well up through that critical window, you'd be surprised at how few sprays you may have to do in that 4 weeks post-bloom into the harvest time period. I also agree with Tim that I think this is a good time period because it's a lower risk, that things like biologicals are a great choice, or other contact products are a great choice during this kind of end of the season management period. One, because risk is really low for the fruit. So you're not, if there's a problem with the use of those products, you're not going to lose the crop. So this is kind of how you tie it together. Use a lot of cultural practices throughout the season, but for your chemical regime when managing powdery mildew needs to really focus in on that critical window around that bloom time period. All right, so let's talk about some fungicide resistance. And the real reason we talk about fungicide resistance is it affects everybody, whether you use products that are prone to fungicide resistance or not. We only have so many chemistries out there. They're getting harder and harder to discover and to use and to register every year. And so our toolkit's only so big and will likely not get that much bigger. And so if we start pulling tools out of that toolkit, what do you have left, right? And as Tim mentioned, we have a national team working on that question, primarily focusing on FRAC 11 or Flint, I think as Tim mentioned, is one of the products. There's obviously several others that fall into that category, but FRAC 11 fungicide resistance, it's a nice system to start in and working on other aspects of fungicide resistance in grape powdery mildew. One of the things, though, that we've learned as a part of this research, in addition to all the great biology and genomics and genetics, is that the understanding of just how to design a program and what resistance is, and just placing everything related, the practical aspects of developing spray programs is often not well understood across everybody. Like even among us in academics, we're really bad at designing spray programs because we don't have to deal with the consequences of rotted fruit, but we're really good at reviewing them, right? So we're learning this that across the globe that we, or across the country, that we are probably in need of just some standardization of language and just kind of sharing of resources related to managing fungicide resistance. And a part of that includes a lot of different things that we've developed. Tim mentioned our website, our resource website right here, and that's framenetworks.wsu.edu. We have a lot of information for you guys as growers related to, we have hot links to all your guys' regional pest management guides. We have things like this decision support tool of, if you have documented FRAC 11 resistance in your vineyard, how do you change your spray program accordingly? We've got a bunch of information on how to scout and sample and test and all of that related on the website, including videos on just what fungicide resistance is, if you're interested in that. But really interesting, or really important, is we do have a case count dashboard. I'm sure we're all a little bit done with case counts at this point, but we have one for powdery mildew. And we've actually been listing the positive FRAC 11 fungicide resistance counts that we've gotten from all the different states across the country. So you can kind of log into this, you get it, you can access it from our resource website to see, are you in an area that has had a lot of documented FRAC 11 fungicide resistance? And if so, maybe that will trigger a thought that if you have any FRAC 11s in your spray program, that you may want to back away from their use. And then we have resources to tell you how to do that. Another great fungicide resistance management tool, and I see that Leslie will be talking about that at your next meeting, is FRAC, the actual group FRAC, the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee, who's defined all the codes for all the different products. But they have a really cool app that you can download for Apple or Android, and you can search by all the different actual fungicide active ingredients to figure out if they're at high or low risk for resistance development. I absolutely love it, and it helps you figure out, oh yeah, that particular active ingredient is a part of this FRAC group or that FRAC group, because they're impossible to remember over a period of time, unless you're Tim Miles, who knows all of them by heart, and we can quiz him after the presentation. That really good resource. But the most important thing, regardless of disease, is how you spray, or how you actually deliver whatever fungicide you want to use to your target. Because if you cannot deliver it, it doesn't matter how good or how well you designed your spray program or how good those products work, they're not getting to where they need to go. And so it's effectively as if you've done nothing. And sprayers have a lot of moving parts, literally and figuratively, that can influence how your spray is being delivered to the vine. Nozzles get clogged, they get worn, they break. Some people, unfortunately, if you have exchangeable nozzles, so nozzles that you can put in and put out, put the wrong nozzle relative to the pressure that their sprayer can deliver. Some of you guys may have sprayers that don't even have nozzles, they're air shear, and that has that's a whole other story on how those particularly work. Tanks, your water tanks can leak. They can have poor agitation. Products can solidify. You may have lines that are clogged that you don't know. Product incompatibility and storage, if you don't properly clean out with your tank after every spray, that can be a major issue. Some of you, if you are larger operations, may have sprayers that have built-in rate controllers. Rate controllers are awesome in concept, in that if you speed up or slow down, it changes the rate that the spray comes out, so you're always delivering the right gallons per acre. Well, rate controllers, if the GPS unit is mounted underneath the tractor, doesn't work. Sometimes if your tires are underinflated or overinflated, they don't work. So you can really have some challenges with just the actual operation of your machine. Also, nobody's perfect, and sometimes if you're spraying a large number of acres, it can be easy to get distracted. Got to watch that favorite TikTok video, and you forget, did I spray that row or not? And that can be a problem. Also, too, depending on the style of machine you're using, you can have broken fan blades, which create uneven patterns of distribution. You can have in pneumatic sprayers, if a nozzle is clogged, you have weird shifts in pressure compensation, which means more product comes out of one nozzle and less out of another. Total gallons per acre is the same, but it's spraying in the wrong place. And then sometimes your air can be misaligned. And so really, there's just a lot of things that can go wrong with a sprayer that I think many people don't consider. When you spray is a big deal too. When you have warm, windy, or dry days, you get lots and lots of drift. So that's something to think about. And when product is drifting, it's not hitting the target, which means you effectively are spraying at a reduced rate, which can help or probably help is not the right word, which can encourage the selection pressure for or populations of a pathogen that are resistant to that particular fungicide. So drift is a really big deal, not only obviously for environmental reasons and neighboring reasons, et cetera, but it's product loss that you sprayed that you thought was going onto the plant that's no longer there. So that's money. Just you watch dollar signs drifting away, but it can also help with fungicide resistance selection. So really, you do need to give your sprayer the attention that it does deserve. So just if you're not routinely calibrating your sprayer, you should actually calibrate it at least once a year. Or ideally, you should be calibrating it every time you change your gallons per acre that are being applied, but definitely at least once a year. A lot of that just has to do with, are you actually delivering what you need to do? For those of you who might be using air blast sprayers, that's a popular sprayer out here by us. I know it's a popular sprayer on the East Coast. Everybody wishes they had a brand new cool Vineyard sprayer, but let's be honest, air blast sprayers are cheap, affordable, they last for forever, and you can usually find them. But they were designed to spray 20 to 30 foot tall apple orchards, right, or orchard systems. So grapes are not really that large, but there are a lot of ways you can play with your air blast sprayer to make it really fit well in your vineyard system. Some of that has to do with just turning off some of those top and bottom nozzles. And in many cases, early season, you can turn off that air assist and you have really great spray coverage early season with very reduced drift. So something to think about for those of you guys that are operating air blast sprayers in your vineyards is maybe do a quick test run this spring where you actually turn off the air assist on that rather than running it at full air. But really, when it comes to figuring out spray practices and how that kind of fits into your overall spray program, it really is true that seeing is believing. And if you haven't used water sensitive paper, I would highly recommend grabbing a bunch, maybe getting together with your fellow vineyard neighbors. They're not cheap, but they are the cheapest thing you could ever do to see if your spray is actually getting to where it needs to go. These are little cards. They're about the size of an index card. They're yellow. They turn blue when they come in contact with oil or water. So you have to wear gloves when you touch them. Otherwise you have little blue fingerprints all over them. But you can just clip them into the canopy. As you run your sprayer by, you can then pull them out and see what that coverage looks like. What are your little speckles, the spray speckles? It also can help you figure out if a nozzle might be broken or if somebody's turning off a tractor too soon before the end of the vineyard row, et cetera. But really cheap. And you don't have to use the full card. We actually, even for our research stuff, because we're very cheap, we'll buy a pack off of Amazon and we actually cut them into little sections so we can stretch that out a little bit. But absolutely one of the best tools you can use for spray coverage. So finally, some tips for a successful growing season, and hopefully this encompasses some of Tim's tips too. First, consider that site and canopy development. He mentioned that, I mentioned that. So hopefully that, I think, emphasizes how important canopy management is when it comes to a lot of fungal and oomycete diseases on grapes. Really understand how your fungicides work. Tim talked about that. Fungicides target different things. If you know how they work, you might actually be able to figure out some of the better ways to insert them in a spray program. If they stick and they're really UV resistant, maybe they're good to do at the end of the season or mid to end of the season. If they are systemic, maybe they're good to go on a couple days before a pending rain event. So that way, product is at least absorbed and not going to be washing off, et cetera. Know that when you're designing a spray program, your sprayer is super important. So make sure it's calibrated. Make sure you understand how water in that tank and air can help you or hurt you with spray coverage. And then also when you're managing a vineyard, we didn't talk about a whole lot in here, but make sure you spray every row. Don't try to manage with spray blow through because the coverage is extremely different as you go across those rows. Here's some light reading. So I think, Tim, these are on our frame website, but for those of you who might have a smartphone, we'll leave this up a little bit here before I go on to the next slide. These are three different articles that the frame team has developed on grape powdery mildew. The first one really talks about kind of weather patterns and how to figure out if we're under a high pressure or low pressure year for grape powdery mildew. The second article is written by a couple of our grad students. It's a really nice guide on how to scout for powdery early in the season, which maybe will help save an early season spray or two. And then this next one, this dialing in disease control, this is a much more intense or in-depth article really on how to design a specific spray program, keeping in mind fungicide resistance management for the multiple or for various grape diseases. So I'll just leave that up for a couple quick seconds. And I can also share these with Leslie and she can circulate them out to the group. And again, all of them are available on Good Fruit Grower. So www.goodfruit.com. And you can just search either Tim's last name, my last name, frame, and they all tend to populate. If you have any questions on fungicide resistance, feel free to reach out to Tim or I. You can also contact us directly through Frame. And so this is our contact information there, our website, our Twitter handle, our Facebook page. But again, you can also email any of us on the team and we'll be happy to chat. We love talking about Frame. Or if you want to reach out to me, here's that same information. And I believe that is all I have. And that's what my PowerPoint says I have.
Excellent. Thank you both, Tim and Michele, for those presentations and educating us on grape disease management and fungicide resistance management, as that's becoming an increasing concern for a lot of us. So I'll encourage folks to enter questions into the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, that's also welcomed. I can open my chat.
So Tim, do you want to do a shameless plug for your workshop next week? Or,
yes, shameless plug, but if
you know what I mean.
you're going to do it, you have to register by tomorrow. And it's for the, we're doing a Michigan specific workshop, but I think it would be applicable to Wisconsin growers too. And it's for managing spray programs. So we're going to look at powdery mildew and botrytis. We're going to have a fantasy vineyard that only has 2 diseases. And it's like a process where we like compare and contrast how to manage those 2 diseases. So we did it last year, and the Michigan growers really liked it. So
I just put that link in the chat for you, for everyone as well, for registering for that. So today is the last day to register. Tomorrow's the last day?
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Tomorrow. Okay, perfect.
And it is a virtual workshop, so anybody can attend. And Leslie, it's just like the one we had with you guys last year. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I highly recommend if you didn't get a chance to attend last year, attending this year.
Yeah, and you'll get basically in the mail. The reason the registration is so far ahead of now is because in the mail you get a really nice book that goes with it, and walks through all the printed slides. And things.
Get one of
there
these.
you go. Perfect.
With lots of stuff.
Excellent. Any questions from the group? In the chat or unmuted? I can't believe it. You must have answered all the questions with your presentation.
Well, crickets. I figured we'd get more, other disease questions, because sometimes when I talk to Wisconsin folks, anthracnose pops up as a concern. There's a little bit more of a black rot concern.
Yeah, I was actually just going to mention that, Tim. This past season for us was very little Downy, at least in some of the vineyards that I was in, but we had a lot more black rot. And I think that snuck up on people kind of almost unexpectedly, because I don't know if it's been a huge issue for us in, previous years. So black rot seemed, Norman. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Norman. Okay, Norman, if you're speaking, you're muted right now. And if you can't unmute or can't speak, you can enter questions into the chat.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect.
Whatever happened to sodium bicarb for powdery mildew? I mean, it works fantastic for my vine crops. What about using it on grapes?
I can go for it if
you
I
go.
don't know.
Yeah.
So I mean, sodium bicarb, I would kind of rate it as moderate. The only thing about it's a contact, so it kills what it touches. And if you spray it frequently, I have a couple growers more in the Traverse City area that are trying to go as close to organic as they can, and they use sodium bicarb quite a bit, but they are kind of geared up to spray frequently, so they might be spraying every 5 days or so, and that during the heat of the time. And they can keep control with that, but that's the thing, it doesn't last very long, and you really have to have good coverage. So it does work really well if you have a smaller vineyard and you're going to like backpack spray it and are geared up to spray frequently. So
and potassium bicarb works even better, and then I put a little bit of cooking oil in it and a little bit of a dispersant agent. So that seems to do really well, like on squash and melons. I've tried it on my grapes, but since I don't keep track of them as well, I'm not sure because they get sprayed with a lot of other things too.
Right. So Norm, that mixing of potassium bicarb and oil. So I know Leslie probably can't recommend a vegetable oil because that's not allowable from a commercial recommendation perspective, but any other oil type, we do a little bit of, some of our organic growers do a little bit of that, but you have to be very careful on the quality of the oil, or if the oil concentration gets really high in that mix, you can actually get quite a bit of burn with potassium,
Right,
at least with
right.
potassium bicarb, right? And I know
I
for
use
us,
canola oil. It's got to be safe because we eat it.
right. Well, yeah. Leslie can talk. The Department of Ag might disagree on some of that stuff, but in practical, but yes, on your home vegetables, you can do whatever you do.
Thank you.
But yeah, so Tim, question for you guys. We don't use a lot of sodium bicarb out here, partly because we've seen ion damage with sodium on foliage. Do you guys get that when you have repeated spray applications where the actual sodium ion causes more of a problem? Obviously, potassium is a more of a normal nutrition.
Well, that's what I use. I
Yeah.
said sodium because that's what it's commonly talked about, but I actually got some potassium bicarbonate and that's what I use. And it works well, but I haven't tried it really that I've documented on the grapes. That's why I was asking you guys if you had tried it and what your results were.
Yep, potassium bicarb is what most of our growers use. I've heard sodium bicarb used as well. I think probably we don't get that damage, Michelle, mainly because it rains a lot here. That's my guess. And at the time when this is a big deal, you'd also be having a lot of dew events because usually when folks are really trying to actively manage mildew, it's like early August or late July that they're out there quite a bit. So I don't know. Yeah. But I don't know if there's a climate effect of that, dry versus wet. But.
Questions?
So Leslie, you said you had a lot of black rot last year.
Yeah, and it tended to be a more of the susceptible varieties. So I know like Petite Pearl is relatively susceptible for us. There's a couple others, but yeah, it seemed to show up and it was pretty ugly, unfortunately. So,
what do you guys do for like weed management and like how clean, I guess, is the floor of the vineyard in those cases? Do you know?
I can't speak for all the commercial growers, but it's pretty variable. I would say. I know like our research station, probably we might have more weeds than a grower who maybe has more time to focus on it, but we also have some pretty resistant varieties where we had those weeds. So.
Yeah, I feel like you have similar use ability for like things like EBDCs to use early season, because I think it's east of the Rockies and then west of the Rockies, so you probably have the same ability to use like manzates and stuff that we do. Typically that's the one part, because there's so much frac 11 resistance that we've been finding with powdery mildew. It's the one part where I'm not totally sure, but usually a strobe at bloom tends to be really helpful for black rot. But it's complicated because we have this resistance issue. So that tends to be the main parts of the program that I think about for black rot. It's like a couple early season EBDCs, having a really clean floor and getting rid of all the inoculum as much as you can, and then something at bloom. And that's sort of the
No, absolutely, that's helpful. And I think our season was a little strange too because it was dry for such a long period, and so that was kind of like, oh, okay, dry, no diseases, and then diseases at the end of the season. So excellent. Well, I'm going to end the poll. Thanks for those that voted. And I think if there are no more questions, that wraps up our webinar today, but we have contact information for both Michele and Tim. And I also posted the links where this recording will be posted on our YouTube channel for Wisconsin Fruit News. So thank our speakers again, Tim and Michele. And see you at the next webinar. Thank you.